Hello, everyone. Housing has certainly emerged as a big topic in this election campaign. All the parties have put forward their platforms on what they would do to address housing affordability. And Leger, in a new poll, is asking respondents what they think about various solutions to the housing crisis and a bunch of other big issues. Very interesting stuff. So, joining us to talk about it is Andrew Enns, the Executive Vice President with Leger. Hi, Andrew. Welcome back.
Hi, Harold. Good to be back. Good to be talking election developments with you again.
Yeah, and it's great to be talking issues where people always tell us they want to hear more about the issues. And you have a pretty good sense of how people are feeling. And maybe we'll start with housing affordability since that's such a big issue. And of course, people in BC are very as consumed by this when it comes to homeownership or renting and high rents in this province. So you asked asked if the top priority of the next government should be focusing on ensuring average Canadian families can afford to buy a home or focusing more on subsidized housing for low income Canadians who have trouble paying the rent. And the country seems to be split 45% say family buying home, 42% low income renters. Is there any difference between how supporters of the different parties feel about this? And if so, like what is it telling you?
Sure. Well, first off, I should say, that split really is indicative to me how pervasive this is. Not just, you might say to yourself, you touched on it. Yeah, this is a Greater Vancouver issue, or it's a Greater Toronto issue. Reality is, it's relative, and it's an issue for basically across the country. I was talking to some folks in the Maritime, and they were going on about how housing has skyrocketed there and how it's hard to get to get into a house. And so I think that's an important sort of factor, that this has actually broadened, I think, from say maybe where it was 5 years ago. From the party's perspective, there are a couple of interesting trends when we look at this question. The Conservatives, and they're not that surprising of trends, I would say, but the Conservatives tend to do a little better on the approach of trying to make houses more affordable for the average home buyer. Whereas if you looked at the NDP, their supporters tend to sort of zero in on supporting that low income home buyer, and the Liberals are really split almost down down the middle. So there is a little bit of difference there for the parties.
So if you're one of these leaders, what do you do when you see that divide? How is there a way to appeal to both interests?
Well, and I think, quite frankly, when you take a look at some of their platform announcements, they are trying to straddle that a little bit. I think the challenge is that it's not. You might say the NDP could focus in exclusively on that low income buyer, but the problem is there's a lot of suburban seats, a lot of seats in suburban Canada, and those home buyers would probably call themselves the average home buyer, and so parties are going to straddle this a little bit and try to do the best they can. And I think what's really going to be important is the party that tries to not only communicate the policy, but some measure of a plan of how they're going to execute this policy in a process. Look, some of these measures, I mean, you know it as well as I, Harold, tackling this foreign buyer through taxes and through penalties for not being living in the house. I dare say, I think a lot of Vancouverites would say it hasn't really had a heck of a lot of impact on the price of a home. So I think there's some skepticism in terms of, are these policies going to take to really take hold? And the party who really sort of sells it as we'll get this in fast might have an advantage.
That was like, actually, you touched on there the second question that Leger asked around solutions and the best way to ensure housing affordabilities. And here the preference was a little clearer. I mean, we had 59% support for some combination of increasing supply, controlling foreign investment and speculation, as opposed to only 25% support for tax incentives and loans as a way to sort of get our way out of this crisis. Um, NDP supporters, in particular, are very big on that first option as opposed to incentives and loans. So,
Right.
how critical of an issue is this? You mentioned that coming up with a plan, um,
Right.
and you expect it to remain top of mind to voters right up to election day.
Well, I think for sure, because I think what you're seeing as as sort of an umbrella where housing's fitting in under is a broader issue of cost of living and inflation and a lot of factors, and housing is a big part of that, big part of that factor. So I do see this issue sticking around, over the course of the campaign. You touched on it. I mean, and all parties have supporters who like the notion of somehow increasing supply to drive down the price of, to lower the price of housing, um, which is, I think, from their perspective, is just preferable, in part because when you start thinking about government loans or special incentives, there's a lot of questions around that. Who qualifies? Do I qualify? How long will it take? When you're trying to buy a house, you have a guy, they're a mortgage broker or somebody's trying to figure out, look, are you going to qualify or not? Is that program going to work for you? So I think ultimately the simplest and clearest thing is somehow drive down the price of homes.
Well, as you say, the devil is in the detail, and what one thing that we know happens at the local level is local governments get pushed back, the so-called NIMBY idea of density, for example, in their neighborhood. Which, if you're going to increase housing supply, you're going to have to increase density in urban areas.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and one thing interesting, Aaron O'Toole of the Conservatives is proposing is tying any kind of investment in major infrastructure, like a new transit line, rail line, or a bridge, to commitments from local governments to accept density around those corridors, which is something that people say, yeah, that makes sense, unless it's in your neighborhood, and then
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's an interesting thing for him to sell during a campaign.
It is, he's trying to draw some different, pieces together, and perhaps do credit there. I think the other thing you talk about is I think parties have to be a bit cautious about. I mean, how far or how much do they expect the price of housing to drop? I would dare
Yes.
say that if you said to if you put out that we expect house prices to drop by 10%, I think you'd get some economists who put their hand up to say we might be trading one problem for another problem.
Yeah, not to mention
Like,
new home buyers who just put all their savings down on a new house and then are going to see it
well,
depreciate in the next year.
you
Yes.
know, like that's a so it's a complicated issue, and I think the answers aren't that easy, but politicians got to put something in the window, and we'll see where this goes.
Another issue that hasn't been easy, and that has been divisive at times, is public versus private healthcare. And Justin Trudeau has gone after Aaron O'Toole and the Conservatives on this question of private versus public. Clearly, he sees it as a winner. And Leger asked about this. I was a bit surprised that 71% of respondents says they're fine with private clinics operating as long
Yeah.
as universal access to public care remains, quality care remains. Only 20% said private care has no place in the Canadian healthcare system. And it was relatively consistent across all parties. Even the NDP had relatively
Yeah.
strong support. So, based on those numbers, like, how should the leaders be dealing with this thorny issue?
Well, I think it's a bit indicative that as quickly as that issue came up in the campaign, it dissipated in the campaign.
Mm,
I think the Liberals may have, heard or maybe in some of their internal research realized that, the precision, sort of this, the very kind of the precise way they went at this issue, actually got into an area where, as Canadians, we've become a bit accustomed to the private for-profit clinics. I mean, I think we may all know somebody who had some laser eye surgery to correct some, to help with their vision, or to clean up a cataract situation. Diagnostic testing's another one where, again, people seem to accept, at that micro level, they seem to accept that. And in fact, some would probably argue that, hey, if some people who can afford it get out of the public lineup and opt for the private, it might shorten the public lineup and speed that up. So I think that's where you see some Canadians going, I don't see this as a big problem. I think if the Liberals are going to go back at this, they have to somehow broaden this to somehow implying that an Aaron O'Toole government would actually start to privatize big parts of the healthcare system, and really jump headlong into the two-tier, which if there's some evidence, then maybe there's something there. But with what they had at this first go, I don't know if this is one that they will continue on, too aggressively.
Okay, we'll have to watch for that then. I was curious that Leger also asked about gun laws, and I'm not sure if that's going to become an issue, or if you think that's going to become an issue. There's certainly, strong support. I think half of respondents favor tougher laws, and only 10% want them loosened. And there seems to be strong support across all parties for further limits on restricted weapons. And urban voters, perhaps not surprisingly, are even more strongly in support of tougher gun laws than the rest of Canadians. Do any of the parties really have sort of any kind of clear advantage when it comes to talking about gun control, or a disadvantage?
Well, certainly, and to your first point, whether or not it's going to be an issue, I noticed the Liberals in their platform, they had a section on the very specific section on the buyback of semi-automatic, mandatory buyback of semi-automatic weapons, which will be controversial in sort of that gun owner community. It's not a large community, but they're vocal and active. And I would say from a political perspective, this presents a bit of a problem for Aaron O'Toole and the Conservatives. They have a bit of a disadvantage. You touched on how this divides, in terms of rural Canada versus urban Canada. Certainly, in urban Canada, guns are seen associated largely with violence and crime. In rural Canada, it's a much different association, and the Conservatives have a very large, rural caucus, and as good MPs, they'll want to represent their constituents. So it presents, Mr. O'Toole will have to be thoughtful on this. He'll have to be very clear, and in addition, the gun law debate is particularly acute in Quebec. For the Polytechnique, a long time ago, but still very front and center in the minds of many. And I think he'll need to be cognizant of how he positions this with respect to being tough on criminality and guns and such, but he may have to walk a fine line on some aspects of where the Liberals will likely want to push him, for sure.
Okay, well, we'll watch for him pushing on that. And
Yeah.
finally, the recent withdrawal from Afghanistan of Canadian forces and citizens. You asked about that and whether people thought we were doing a good job, and I guess only 1 in 4 say, 1 in 4 say we've done a bad job. Only 14% say we've done a good job. And there's a bunch of folks in the middle. But perhaps concerning for the Liberals is that only 26% of their own supporters say the government has done a good job. And this is one of those unanticipated issues that emerged right at the start of the campaign. Do these results tell you anything about how the parties are dealing with it, or how they should be dealing with it?
Well, I mean, I've always maintained, Harold, that this wasn't a campaign. This wasn't an election issue, as opposed to an issue that came up in the election. I don't think Canadians are necessarily overly seized by this, and I don't believe that it's going to really become a ballot, an impact on the at the ballot box. The impact of this issue was really the timing of it couldn't have been worse for the Liberals in the launch of their campaign. It literally hit within days of the campaign beginning, and it successfully took Justin Trudeau and the Liberals off their message for almost a week. And that's critical. The starts are critical, and as we see, it sort of snowballed a little bit, and I do feel, the fact that they couldn't get a good rhythm in the campaign has hurt them a bit at the polls, and so they've got some ground to make up. I think the other side of this issue is that there's a couple of thousand Afghan citizens who are still in country who were actively supporting Canadian forces, and I would say feel somewhat at risk with the Taliban in charge. And I mean, heaven forbid that there, that anybody's apprehended, or that news breaks during, again, during the campaign. That wouldn't be great news for the Liberals, in terms of the fact that here are some people that we couldn't get out. It would bring questions back again in terms of, did we do everything we could? Could we not have done better? And it wouldn't be welcome news. So, I'm sure it's not something that, they like have hanging over them, but we'll see where this goes. Right now, it seems to be dissipating.
Well, they don't want their kind of the moment that the Tories had in 2015 with the picture of the Syrian boy on the
Oh,
beach, that kind of horrific image that could pop up.
no, and
That's perhaps a risk.
and
Yes.
certainly, I think the irony with, if that were to happen with Justin Trudeau now, as the government, and having to somehow explain, and whereas in 2015 he artfully took advantage of that, and put the prime minister on the defensive, almost from the get go.
Right. Well, interesting as always. Thanks for your insights, Andrew. And when we
Good.
talk next week, we'll have what,
Well,
three debates under our belt, two in French, one in English. So, well, there'll be lots more to talk about, and heading into the final week and a half of the campaign.
yeah, for sure. I think we are going to be in, but when we meet again, we'll be into a new campaign.
All right. Happy Labor Day. See you next week. Thank you.
Sounds good, Harold. Bye bye.